Welcome to our workshop today, and a special welcome to our student. And welcome to all our online audience. My name is Sarah Malanga. I'm sitting here in Malawi, Lilongwe, and I will be your host today. So today's topic is biodiversity assessment and conservation. Our first speaker today is Nikita Faria. Nikita works with TUT University, and she is a passionate conservationist and academic mentor specializing in fire ecology and plant studies. She is known for her approachable teaching style, and we are so happy to learn from you, Nikita, today. By the end of Nikita's talk, you should be able to, 1, understand what vegetation is and why it is important to ecosystems. 2, recognize key factors to consider before conducting a vegetation survey. 3, identify and apply different sampling strategies and survey techniques. Lastly, you should be able to acknowledge common challenges in vegetation surveying and how they affect data accuracy. Yeah, Nikita, the screen is all yours.
Okay, so my focus is obviously vegetation. I know you guys are going to be looking at a whole bunch of other survey techniques when it comes to like small mammals and maybe larger ones. But obviously, when we have our mammals, we always have to know what our vegetation is. So we can't have the larger, more hairy things unless we know what our green is. So just to start off with, what is vegetation? A lot of people always see it as a large sea of green, as we like to describe it. It's often very intimidating. Nobody is not sure of what's going on there. So when people see vegetation, they often see what I have in this picture over here. But in actual fact, just on a small scale, it's made up of two main components. That is your herbaceous and your woody component. Herbaceous being grasses and forbs, and then your woody component being your woodies, which are your trees, which occur at different height classes. So the question is, why do we need to survey vegetation? The first thing is vegetation represents an ecosystem. We have a number of different ecosystems, specifically in South Africa, but if you look internationally, our vegetation is what makes what an ecosystem is. Without the vegetation component, we wouldn't have an ecosystem. Vegetation also represents our primary production, obviously it being plants. Vegetation acts as a food source for wildlife, and vegetation is a habitat for wildlife. Okay, so what do we have to consider before starting any vegetation survey? The first thing is the purpose of the study. Why are we surveying? What are we looking at? The second part that we look at is the scale of the study. How large are we going? Are we only looking at a few hectares, or are we looking at a few thousand hectares, or even a few million hectares? The third thing we look at is the overall habitat type. This will affect the kind of survey techniques you need to do. And obviously the resources available. When we're in more remote areas, obviously our resources are a little bit more limited. So we have to consider all these different factors before we start any type of vegetation surveying. Okay, so obviously with vegetation as well as mammals, we get various sampling strategies. Okay, so the first being systematic sampling. So systematic sampling is when we have regular or systematic intervals, and these are usually fixed intervals. So if we have a look at this picture, you can see it's been gridded out. We can take each corner of the grid as, let's say, 100 meters. So with systematic sampling, every 100 meter is then surveyed. It can be either plot or quadrats or point-based, but each of those points are then surveyed. So that's systematic. Every single area has exactly the same distance. Then we have stratified sampling. So I'm going to show you the picture here first because it's just easier to explain. This is a major sampling strategy that we use in terms of vegetation. So the first thing we do is we have to take a Google image map, and we identify different vegetation types or units within the picture. So those are the black lines there, obviously outlining the different vegetation units. And then within the vegetation units, we then go out and have a look, scan it, just to check, are we on the right path, or do we have to move certain things? So we often use roads or rivers or any visual things to start marking it out, because these kind of units can never be square, like you would see with a stratified sampling unit, as vegetation is never straight. And within each of those sampling units, we then place our sample sites. So a lot of the times it is random, and that's where we can move on to random sampling. So if we're going to look at random sampling, just as random sampling, this is when every point in the survey area should have an equal chance of being chosen. So again, we have our grids. We often put it into like a spreadsheet with each coordinates of each grid is put in, and then the program will throw out the number of the coordinates that we have to randomly sample. So again, like I say, with vegetation, we often use stratified, because the two other types of sampling techniques don't cover the different areas that we have to do in vegetation sampling. So like say we have a more dense vegetation area and then a grassland area. If we're going to look at it on a random scale, maybe the more dense area might not be surveyed as much as the grassland area. So we need to ensure that all the areas are equally surveyed, and that's where the stratification comes in, and why we have stratified sampling, because we ensure that each point is within the stratified units are then surveyed. So as you can see on this picture, each unit has between 2 to 3 different sampling plots that are then surveyed to identify then the vegetation units. Okay, so moving on. Now we've done the different sampling strategies. What type of sampling techniques do we do? So in terms of vegetation, there's two main techniques that we use, and that is point-based and area-based methods. Putting it shortly, you'll see I'll refer to area-based as maybe plot list sampling, and point-based as point-based as plot list sampling, and area-based as plot sampling. Okay, so your point-based methods. These are primarily used to determine felt condition. So there's a number of different techniques that have been developed for point-based methods. One of them being a wheel point method, which is a wheel with different spokes in it, and then you walk the wheel, and each time one of the spokes hits the ground, you identify the nearest plant. We then have the shoe point method, which is what we recommend for a lot of our students to use, as this is a method if you don't have a lot of resources you can easily use. So this is when you walk, you take a step, usually like 1 meter, depending on the size of the person, and then the nearest plant to the shoe is then identified. And then we have another method, the line intercept method. So this is when a tape is then put out, and at every 1 meter interval, depending on the size, you identify the nearest plant to that 1 meter. So you walk along the tape, and then you identify each point at every 1 meter interval. So during my practical year, we had to determine the felt condition of a certain area. So we had to identify a 200 hectare area within a reserve, and then stratify that to 2,000. So I'm going to be speaking as 2,000 hectares, even though the image is only 200. Okay, so the first thing I did was I stratified the area into various vegetation units, which I identified. I then, as you can see here, there is 4 different vegetation units. Within each of those vegetation units, I then had to randomly select sample sites, which is your black points over here. So each of those sample sites then I surveyed. So this just gives you an image of that little black point over there. That was the site that I then surveyed. So I used the line intercept method for this one. So we put out a quadrant of 50 by 50 meters using tape. And then I surveyed every single 1 meter point. I identified then the nearest plant. Just to consider your point-based methods, it does not take the woody component into consideration. It only takes in your herbaceous component. So I was only identifying the closest grass or the closest forb within the area. If I wanted to then survey the woodies, then we had to take a completely different approach, which I will then explain when we do the next point. Okay, so this also just gives you an idea of the number of species that I identified. As you can see, it's mostly just grasses and forbs. With the felt condition score, felt condition method, we don't identify the forbs, but we do encourage our students now to just start learning the different forbs that are out there. Okay, so the next method that we use is the plot-based method. So this can either be quadrats or it can be belt transects. Quadrats vary in size, so what you need to do here is then identify everything within the quadrat. So this is again, you start identifying all your herbaceous material, which is your grasses and forbs, and then the woodies come into play here. So often then you would do, like I said previously, you don't identify the woodies. So then you would have to run probably a belt transect to identify the different woodies that occur within your area. So I used a belt transect when I did my master's study. So my master's was based in Kruger National Park. We looked at the different experimental burn plots that have been running over 50 years within Kruger. And at each burn plot, they have different burning regimes that they do. So these are just an example of each EBP. So that's in experimental burn plot that they had. And within each one, they had different fires that they used to burn. So that was at different intervals. So for example, they had areas that didn't burn at all, areas that burned at every third year interval in, let's say, February or April, or just a number of different, or every 6 years. So that's just an idea of like, that's what each number indicates over there. So what I did is we had 4 different areas that we surveyed with in each experimental burn plot. So we looked at the no burn, we looked at the triennial February burn, the triennial August burn, and the annual August burn. So annual being every year, triennial being every 3 years. So we didn't control when these fires were burned. That is a program that has been running by Kruger, but we just surveyed the areas. So what I did is within each of the areas that I surveyed, we put a belt transect, which was 10 meters by 100 meters. And I identified everything within. So the belt transect was placed within the center of the treatment. And it was always placed downslope. So I had to identify every single species that occurred within this belt transect, and that was forbs, grasses, and woodies. And in terms of the woodies, I needed to place them into height classes as well. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that because then we'll just get too complicated here. But yeah, so the reason why I also just put this specifically that we have to survey downslope, and that is also in terms of your point-based surveys, is because it's of the Katina effect. When you have something surveying from the top of a slope towards the bottom of the slope, it can change. Your vegetation changes. This could be due to a number of factors like rainfall, slope angle, your nutrients start going down in terms of soil. So that's why we want to try and get as much species diversity in. So that's why we survey downslope. Okay, so moving on. What are problems with surveying vegetation? Okay, number 1, species identification. We are all limited to the knowledge that we have. So we try and implement field guides, but sometimes the field guides don't have specific species, especially when it comes to forbs. So when that was a challenge that I came with, we had to then collect the species, put it in a plant press, and then identify it at the Skukuza herbarium. The second one is your sampling designs. So depending on what your reason for your study, you obviously need to select the right sampling strategy you're going to use. So are you going to use point-based? Are you going to use plot-based? It all depends on what you want to look at. So if you're looking, for example, for felt condition score and you're doing a plot-based sampling, you're not going to get the right information. If you're looking for diversity and then you're doing a point-based, you're not going to get diversity because you're only going to get the species you identify to the nearest point. Okay, another issue that we have is dense or inaccessible vegetation. So in areas where we have bush encroachment occurring, this can become an issue. We can't easily get into those areas to survey it. So that's especially when you're doing your point-based methods. If your transect fall runs right through a dense vegetation unit, it becomes very difficult to try and ID because you're busy trying to dodge the different trees, or a lot of them are have thorny components to it. So that can become an issue. Another problem is seasonal variation. So with vegetation, what makes it easy to identify is obviously the inflorescence or the flowers or the fruits. And this all obviously depends on seasonality. So a lot of the times we survey during the towards the end of the wet season, yeah, in South Africa, which is February, March. That's because it's easier to identify plants then. But if people survey out of those seasons and the inflorescence or the flowers have now disappeared, it becomes very difficult to identify these plants. Another problem that we face is disturbance effects. So this will be, for example, if you survey right next to a road or surveying in areas that have previously been utilized for something else, and now they've gone through different stages of vegetation succession, and we are not going to find a true reflection of what's showing in the area if we're going to survey that. So we always tell our students, please don't survey right next to a road, take 10 meters in and then start surveying afterwards, because it takes away that disturbance effect, especially when you look at roads. We call it the edge effect. And another thing is observer biased. So with students especially, like what I've noticed is when you are surveying an area, you only ID what you know. They don't want to go through the extent of IDing species that they don't know, so that becomes what we call observer biased, and they will just place, let's say, Panicum maximum because that's a species they know. Or they'll put like Heteropogon contortus, which is another species they know. But when they becomes your more complicated species, which they've never seen before in an area, then they don't tend to put the effort into trying to identify it. So that then starts to skew the data. Okay, guys, so that basically comes to the end of my presentation. It's short and sweet. But just a little quote here that every plant tells a story. You just need to learn to listen, because your plants are what determines your vegetation, what determines your area, what determines your ecosystem. And without plants, we won't have conservation areas or places that we can have our large mammals and our small mammals in it. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Nikita. This was indeed short and sweet. And when you said it was short and sweet, I was worried because you got my comments. That was what I was also about to say. Yeah, I am a vet. I haven't learned more about vegetation, but this is quite very interesting. And hearing all the challenges that you meet, I'm now asking myself, what can be the solution to that? Like for the dense and inaccessible vegetation, I'm asking myself, how do they overcome that? Do you just leave the area and just maybe guess the numbers according to the next, like to the nearest accessible point, or what you do? That's my first question for you. As
Okay.
and yeah, and just before you answer, I just want to tell Wisdom, if the students have any questions, would they please come forward to the screen?
Okay, so in terms of if you get to areas that are inaccessible, yeah, you need to try and find the nearest point that you can obviously access, but also trying your best not to skew the data. So you need to ensure it's in the same unit and it's not too far off from where you started surveying. So,
Hmm.
like for example, when I did my master's, we did have an area which the actual experimental burn plot was a bit smaller than all the others. So we couldn't put out a 100 by 10 meter because it would have had that edge effect. So what we had to do is actually break it up. So we had to do a 50 by 10 and then take a few meters down and then do another 50 by 10 just to be able to fill in the actual surveys that we needed to do.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank Wisdom. Is there any questions from the student?
Point-based method applications.
Yes, okay. So for point-based methods, we use it when we determine fault condition for an area. So we will so that's to determine like your carrying capacity. So we need to know what vegetation is there, if it's palatable or unpalatable, so that we can then determine the carrying capacity for the area. So that's where point-based methods are used. And also they can be used to identify a key species for an area, like a dominant species. So a lot of the reserves want to know what the dominant species of an area is. And that's where point-based methods come in as well, because it just identifies your more dominant species.
Yes, Dr. Owa, would you please unmute?
Always a comment. Nikita, well done. She can sell ice to an Eskimo. She is very good at what she does. And for the learners that listen to her, one day you're going to be sitting in a lecture hall, and remember, a short pencil is better than a long memory. I hope you took down notes, because if you don't realize after Nikita's spoken that plants are very important. Where do we get our oxygen from? Plants. So every time you see a plant, you walk past it and you say thank you to that plant, because it's giving you so much and you don't even realize it. But as what Nikita said, if we don't have plants, we won't have animals. Remember, it's all linked to the ecosystem. Now, you all know what the ecosystem is. So, guys, remember, we do talk fast. You haven't heard me yet. I've slowed myself down. But you got to keep up and remember to always take notes. Remember, a short pencil is better than a long memory. And Nikita, once again, well done. You are good at what you do.
Thank you so much, Dr. O, for the wise words. A short pencil is better than a long memory. You know, as a student, I also did that at once, where I thought I can remember everything. But I learned that that was a mistake and I started taking notes down. Yeah. So the students, please take some notes down. And yeah, the talk is being recorded, so you will catch up on that. And for the next speaker, we'll ask if they can go slow. Yeah. I see we have another hand from James, Rarin James. Would you please unmute and ask your question?
Okay, thank you so much. Mine is just to appreciate the speaker for the good lesson. I myself, I understood. I'm also in a profession of conservation. I did conservation as my profession, and also based on the biodiversity, and I did all that. I know it's a hard one, and based on how the nectar present on that, actually it's a good work. I also work with the carbon credit project back in Kenya, and to actually deal with the ecosystem and how you'll do your own survey is really helping me with the way you plan your own things. So I really appreciate for that, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, James. Yeah. Nikita, thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate, and it was indeed short and sweet with so much information. Yeah, thank you. And I see in the chat there are some messages. I don't know if there are some questions, then would you please just type in some answers, respond to some in the chats? Would really appreciate that. All right.
Thanks, Doctor.
All right, thank you so much. And now we're going to move on to our second speaker. Nikita has covered the vegetation side. Now we're going to move to the animal side.